Hello, my name is Chris Leininger, and I am the newest adult service librarian here at Wright Public Library. And it is my very nice honor to welcome everybody here at the last spring 2021 Far Hill Speaker Series, which is a partnership between the Wright Library and the Oakwood Historical Society. And our last presentation for the spring is entitled The Dean, Dillinger, and Dayton, Ohio, and is presented by Steve Grismer. And I'm going to turn it over to the president of the Oakwood Historical Society, Donna Rosenbaum, to introduce. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. First of all, I appreciate the promotion, but I'm just the coordinator for the lecture series for the Historical Society. But to all of you who are watching, we want to welcome you so much to the speaker series. It's a wonderful effort that two organizations put on. Before I introduce Steve formally, just a little bit about, because this is the last in the spring series, we will be doing 3 presentations in the fall. Those dates are September the 19th, October the 17th, and November the 21st. They'll all be at 2 o'clock. Now, to be honest, full disclosure, everything else is to be determined. We're going to be working on speakers, and depending on what happens with the pandemic, it will either continue to be virtual, or if we can, we'll do it in person. But please look for details starting early August in terms of the list of speakers and how we're going to be handling the fall portion of the speaker series. So that said, this afternoon, I have the real pleasure and privilege to introduce Steve Grismer. Steve's a retired Dayton police officer who spent over 25 years policing. He's gone through a variety of assignments, from being a uniform patrol officer to working on the staff, working investigations, internal affairs, drug enforcement, vice, intelligence, and training. He's also had been a member of the hostage negotiation team and active in the Fraternal Order of Police, and has held several offices within the Fraternal Order of Police. But more importantly, Steve, in 2008, began a journey to become a historian of the police in Dayton and the other municipalities, the incorporated cities here in Dayton. And he started with an exhibit at Carlisle Park called Patrolling the Streets of Dayton. And that led to starting an organization, the Dayton Police History Foundation, that Steve is a trustee of. He lectures to the current classes of the police cadets. He also is a member of the faculty of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Dayton. And he has authored the book that he's going to talk about today, The Dean, Dillinger, and Dayton, Ohio. And I'll tell you, I've read it, and I think we're in for a treat in learning how policing and the actual development of Dayton tie so closely together. So again, with great privilege and honor, I introduce Steve Grismer.
Okay. Well, let me go ahead and get my screen up here. And let's see what we can do here. And hopefully everybody can see that. I want to thank Donna and Chris and Elizabeth Schmidt, and of course, all of you for having me here today. I always like to start when I give a presentation by spending, maybe 2 minutes introducing our organization. Dayton Police History is an outgrowth of the Dayton Police History exhibit that took place at Carlisle Park from May to November of 2008. Now, the exhibit was a collaborative effort between 2 Dayton police sergeants and 2 directors of Dayton History to research, plan, and then create a temporary exhibit telling the story of local law enforcement from 1796 to present. As Donna mentioned, it was called Patrolling the Streets of Dayton. And at the time, it was the largest temporary exhibit held at Carlisle Historical Park in its largest museum facility, the Dickey Family Transportation Center. Although attendance records were not kept, park officials know that 20,000 students visited the exhibit. And by our measure, that made it a success. When it was over, all the artifacts and the photographs, they were returned to the owners, but there was this desire to keep the history alive. And so on January 1st, 2010, Dayton Police History Foundation, Inc. was chartered by the state of Ohio. DPHF is a private, nonprofit, 501c3 charitable organization, and it's strictly dedicated to the preservation of local law enforcement history. Now, we are exploring with Carlisle Historical Park officials the steps necessary to establish a permanent law enforcement museum. Now, these are concept renderings of what it may look like and what it might hold. We do hope that someday a Dayton Metropolitan Police Museum becomes a reality. And to that end, we have published a number of books, as you can see at the bottom of the screen: Drenched Uniforms and Battered Badges, How Dayton Police Emerged from the 1913 Flood, and The Christmas Killings, 40 Hours to Justice. Both books are available at Carlisle Park and also at Amazon, and all proceeds go to our museum initiative. Right now, DPHF has undertaken its most ambitious project to date, and that is why I am here. Donna has given me the opportunity to talk about our current exhibit, Bootleggers, Bandits, and Badges, From Dry Times to Hard Times in Dayton, Ohio, as well as a book that I wrote that commemorates that exhibit, The Dean, Dillinger, and Dayton, Ohio, Legend, Lore, Legacy. Both the exhibit and the book recount the development of local law enforcement during 3 distinct periods in Dayton, Ohio, and U.S. history. And that would be the temperance movement, Prohibition, and the Great Depression. What you will discover is that arguably the greatest growth in local policing occurred during the 1930s. Now, I'm a visual person, so I will be showing a lot of imagery today related to both the exhibit and Dayton's past. So this is my game plan. I ask that you please hold your questions to the end. I like to get through the exhibit because I have a lot of information to impart, and then I am willing to hang around and answer whatever questions you may have. I am going to concentrate on the development of local law enforcement during the Great Depression. But first, I will spend the next 7 to 8 minutes or so touching on the evolution of policing during the 19th and the 20th centuries through to Prohibition, just to kind of give you the context. This is the entrance to the Bandits and Badges exhibit, by the way. You go through 60 years of law enforcement, beginning with the end of the Civil War, during the temperance movement, into the first 2 decades of the 20th century to 1920. So that's my start. Let me quickly drop back in time to kind of give you a sense of where law enforcement, how it began here in Dayton. Within a year of being settled in 1796, Dayton appointed its first lawman, a constable. Beginning in 1805, it elected a town marshal. This practice remained unchanged well beyond the Civil War. Now fast forward, in 1858, Cincinnati, the nation's 6th largest city, formed Ohio's first police force. That same year, the city of Dayton paid 6 watchmen to patrol Dayton's 6 political wards. Each watchman was beholden to his ward councilman. In 1866, Cleveland formed Ohio's 2nd police department. And in 1867, Dayton, the 3rd largest city in Ohio and the 45th largest city in the nation, was authorized by the state to organize a Dayton Metropolitan Police Force. Now, this is the first known photograph of an assembly of Dayton police officers. Patrolmen were paid today's equivalent of $3.78 an hour, and they worked 12 to 14 or more hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. In other words, there were no days off. But Dayton patrolmen were eventually granted 6 days off every year, but only on the condition that they took no more than 1 day in any 1 month. And they also received at the same time a cut in pay. Police officers carried a nightstick, maybe a pocket pistol, and they patrolled on foot. You see, policing was primitive in the early years. And you'll notice that in this photograph, I have several things circled. One is a uniform code, and as you saw in one of the previous slides, we have one from this time frame on exhibit at Carlisle Park, and also Sergeant Daniel's belt and belt buckle, the ones that are in this picture, are on display at the exhibit. Now, one of the early crises that the police faced was in February of 1874. Dayton was the first major U.S. city to be swarmed by the Women's Temperance Crusade. There were 350 saloons in Dayton. 200 crusaders in bands of 22 women began to visit the bars and pray for the imbibing men's souls. This was a national story, followed by the New York Times at least 5 or 6 times, all the way through into April. The bottom line, the women were unsuccessful in closing many saloons. This was primarily a town of German and Irish immigrants, after all. But the movement gained traction in the next century, leading to Prohibition. Now let's fast forward. The first chapter of my book, The Dean, Dillinger, and Dayton, Ohio, begins in 1903, and that's a special year. The Dean, Chief Rudy Wurstner, who served nearly 5 decades, was the nation's Dean of Police Chiefs. His first full year on the force was in 1903. The Wright brothers' bicycle shop was on his walking beat. And as you know, in 1903, the Wright brothers conquered the skies with first powered man flight, an event that defines Dayton to this very day. Over in Indianapolis, an infant was born in 1903. His name, John Dillinger. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about John Dillinger later. And I want to bring up real quick a little side note. It's not in the book, it's not at the exhibit, but in 1904, Dayton police issued the world's first speeding ticket to a fellow by the name of Harry Myers, who was traveling at 12 miles per hour in excessive speed on West 3rd Street. Now, I call this the 1910s, the decade of death, because over 1,000 local citizens had their lives tragically lost. One of the 20th century's 10 worst natural disasters in U.S. history was the 1913 Great Dayton Flood. As many of you know, 92 people were recorded to have died during that flood, and estimates ranged up to 128 people. Then there was, in this decade, there was the Great War. Greater Dayton lost 200 men in those battles in that war. And then in 1918, there was the Spanish flu. And over a 4-month period in 1918, 700 people died. And of course, 1916 for Dayton police officers was an especially tragic year because 3 of their police officers died in just that 1-year span, 4 months apart, evenly spaced. And also in September of 1916, Dayton's first black patrolman, William Jenkins, while making an arrest of 4 men, was nearly beaten to death, but he did survive. On the upside, Dayton Police was arguably the first in the nation to assign motorcycles to police precincts. It also purchased 4 Model T Fords and a Buick that would be driven from the police garage when needed. This remained unchanged for most of the 1920s. Still, the primary method of policing for patrolmen remained on foot, just as it had been for 50 years. On the upside, their hours of work were reduced to 56 hours per week, and they received 26 days off per year. In this particular picture, you see Patrolman Lucius Rice. He was the second African-American police officer appointed, and he had a storied career, and in fact is today in the Dayton Walk of Fame. And I hopefully will be able to talk a little bit about him at the end of this presentation. Society was changing. Policewomen were reluctantly hired in 1914. The impact of women cannot be overstated, as evidenced by the temperance and suffrage movements. 1919 saw to the success of both with the 18th and 19th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. This is the entrance to the Bandits and Badges section of the Roaring Twenties, a period of cultural liberation and, of course, Prohibition. Policing had an awakening in this decade. The Dayton Liquor Squad was aggressive, but during a time of prosperity, there was no political will to provide the police the necessary funding after 1928. The times proved to be excessively bloody for policemen. This was the most dangerous decade in local and national history for lawmen, and was followed by the second most dangerous decade, the 1930s. You see at the lower left a picture of Captain John C. Post. He was killed 1 week after that photograph was taken for the newspaper. He was not the only one killed in 1927. There were 5 police officers killed in a 5-month span in separate incidents, each of them shot to death. A terribly tragic year. A couple other pictures to point out. You see Chief Wurstner, but there's the infamous bootlegger King George Remus, who was incarcerated in the Montgomery County Jail, and Dayton Liquor Squad Patrolman Russell Fall. You see him, he'll come up in pictures and in my presentation a couple of times, so keep him in mind. Okay, so what I've given you in about 7 or 8 minutes is the intro, the prologue, and the first 4 chapters and 105 pages of my book. Now I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes or so talking about the last 7 chapters of the book, and maybe even touch a little bit on the epilogue. The bootleggers and bandits and racketeering, the bootlegging and racketeering enterprises and the sheer viciousness of the 1920s were a prelude to what law enforcement would face during the Great Depression. They were stuck enforcing an unpopular law with poor equipment during a period of cultural liberation. The new reality was not good for police officers. As I say in my book, the year 1929 was crimson. The second month, saturated blood red in a bootlegging mob garage, had given the nation its starkest image of a decade of prohibition. And 2 months before the year closed out, the US economy dripped red ink. Although there is no date certain for its end, the Great Depression, which is what I am going to talk about now, is generally considered to have run up to World War II. And I'm going to try to take us all the way up to 1941 in my presentation. Now, if you look at the top right on this particular slide, you'll see the local bootlegger by the name of Fouts, who made the acquaintance of George Bugs Moran in the late 1920s. Fortunately, Fouts was not around Chicago on February 14th. Moran was Al Capone's target on St. Valentine's Day, but he was late for a bootlegging meeting. 6 hitmen for Scarface, disguised as police officers, were unable to take out Moran, but they all but wiped out his gang, killing 7. While he still had a big name, he fell from stature as a Chicago mob boss and a peer to Al Capone. Now, you may think Chicago, being 7 hours away, was a world away from the Gem City, but it is a lot closer than you think. Bugs Moran continued his life of crime over the next 16 years, but Dayton law enforcement would forever bring his crime career to an end. His local connection was Al Fouts. Now, David Greer, who I believe gave the presentation last month, has a little book that talks about Fouts. It's called The Little Man Who Wasn't There in Search of Al Fouts, and it's a book that I highly recommend. Virgil Doc Summers, believed to be a John Dillinger associate, was a strong-arm man for the Drewer gang in St. Louis. In 1933, he was convicted of murder and a number of robberies, but upon his release from the Illinois prison in 1943, he teamed up with Moran. Moran, Summers, and Fouts would be tried and convicted for robbing a money runner from Winters National Bank on West 3rd Street, but also for a bank heist in Ansonia, Ohio. And of course, I go into a lot more detail about this in my book, and it is there at the exhibit. So having brought him up, now I'm going to drop back to 1929. On October 29th, 1929, exactly 10 years and 1 day after the passage of the National Prohibition Act, the stock market collapsed. Nationwide, the rising crime rate brought on by Prohibition simply accelerated in the next decade. The landscape changed. Even though Prohibition would continue to be the law for the next 4 years until the end of 1933, police shifted its focus away from bootlegging to a new phenomenon, armed robbery, bank robbery more specifically. You can see a picture of the Wesley brothers up there at the top of the slide. Those men robbed a bank on West 5th Street, and they hightailed out of Dayton and went directly to, of all places, Chicago. They were tracked to Chicago by Inspector Seymour Yendis, and they were captured and brought back to Dayton where they faced prosecution. Dayton was a major metropolis in the center corridor between two small cities, each known as Little Chicago because of their underworld connections. The criminality between these cities run throughout my book. Now, at the bottom of the slide, you're going to see wanted cards maintained by the Dayton Detective Bureau in 1931 and 1933. Pretty Boy Floyd's territory ran between Akron and Toledo. The reason his card was in our collection or in our record section here in Dayton was because he was a feared threat to travel south. In 1930, Clyde Barrow was in a Texas jail when Bonnie Parker slid a gun to him. He escaped. And what many do not know is that he was arrested in Middletown for a store robbery. He was captured and returned from Middletown, Ohio to Texas to face jail time. The increase in the number of bank robberies in Dayton and the Greater Dayton area were considerable. The Fox of Gangland, Bob Zwick, and his gang hit the Phillipsburg Bank in 1930, an investigation that was conducted by the Dayton Detective Bureau. Zwick lived in Dayton, and he had ties to Hamilton. He was a terror to his own gang and even to other gangsters, like Dayton's public enemy number one, Floyd Shawhan, who he extorted. Zwick was not the only bank robbing threat, though, here in Dayton. The Xenia Avenue Trust Company was a bank that had been robbed twice when it was held up again in April of 1930. The suspects were never captured by police, but they were believed for years to have been Killer Burke and Crane Neck Nugent, who committed the heist. And they thought that they committed the heist while they were traveling from Nugent's place in Hamilton, Ohio, to Chicago. Now, who are these two guys? Well, Burt and Nugent were two of Capone's St. Valentine's Day killers. And by the way, Nugent once tried to kill Bob Zwick over a gang dispute in Hamilton. When Dayton Police Chief Wurstner received a tip that the Xenia Avenue Bank was going to be robbed yet again, he ensured that there would not be a fourth time. Patrolman Walter Dempsey was authorized to take a Tommy gun from storage. He and Patrolman Brian Houck staked out the bank in May. When two bandits entered, Dempsey fired through the window. A gang battle ensued that looked like a scene from Chicago. In the end, one robber was killed, another had a head wound, and he would die from that head wound a few years later. Both men were from, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly now, Chicago, and both were parolees from the Indiana State Prison. Now, that is the same prison where Dillinger was residing. This is Chief Wurstner with a Cadillac V8 known as the Bank Flyer. It was customized with steel bumpers, making it, quote, possible to go through a brick wall. It had a steel shield to protect the radiator and impenetrable tires and bulletproof windshield. It had special racks inside to hold machine guns, shotguns, rifles, tear gas, and all kinds of other weapons. It was kept in a bay at police headquarters. Now the Dayton Police Arsenal was mobile. If a bank alarm sounded at the police headquarters, the motorman would start the bank flyer and the flying squadron would scramble into the car and they would head to the crime scene. It was not practical, but it made great publicity, and it was a warning to would-be thieves to stay away. Unfortunately, it was publicity that did not work. The truth was that most patrolmen in Dayton still patrolled beats on foot, just as they had for 65 years. They carried guns in their pockets or small holsters that they had covered with their shirts or their coats. On the other side, you had killing bandits roaming the Midwest, victimizing the most lucrative targets: banks, jewelry stores, gun shops, even police arsenals and policemen themselves. And they did so with impunity. Gangsters were acquiring fully automatic and semi-automatic weapons, many designed during World War I. And they had cutting-edge automobiles with powerful engines. They also were able to hit and run across city borders and state lines without being pursued or being caught if chased. It was a perfect setting for gangsters. As everywhere else in the nation, the Great Depression strained the resources of the city of Dayton. Thousands of people lost their jobs. Its largest employer, NCR, laid off 5,000 employees. At the same time, Dayton annexed 7 square miles with 36,000 new citizens who were eligible for city services. Yet these citizens could not afford to pay the taxes. Yet the city of Dayton, with the help of some business people, found the funds to invest in the police department. And they did so as never before. The question is, why would they do this during the Great Depression? Fear and public pressure. I like this particular slide because it shows you some of the tools of the trade for the police at the time. The one thing is that in October of 1931, police officers were for the first time able to wear their guns on the outside of their coats and the outside of their shirts. The chief wanted to make sure that the public knew and that gangsters knew that his officers were ready to conduct battle. And by the way, the other item that's on this screen of interest is the microphone. The installation of one-way radio receivers in 11 newly marked police cars on September 24th, 1932 forever changed patrol and would come into play almost exactly 1 year later. It also began the phasing out of patrol call boxes. Officers in radio cars on patrol could immediately respond to an emergency. They can respond to not only emergency calls, but they could receive APBs, which are all points bulletins, or BOLOs, which means be on the lookout for whatever. Just as Chief Wurstner had done with the bank flyer, he publicized every advance in weapons and equipment to reassure a frightened public and as a warning to gangsters. Now back at our exhibit, we have some 1930s police artifacts on display, as well as uniforms, as you can see here, and larger items. In my book, The Dean, Dillinger, in Dayton, Ohio, I recount Chief Wurstner's incredibly eventful career spanning 5 decades and Dillinger's mere 5 months in 1933 in Dayton. Yet it is Dillinger that everyone knows. In this presentation, you're going to see some images of the chief. You've already seen some images of the chief for that matter. But to know his story, you really have to get the book. And I'm going to relate the Dillinger saga, but it's going to be in an abbreviated way. And obviously the book is far more detailed. Chief Wurstner authorized assignments for the year 1933, the year I call the Dillinger year. And for 5 officers, their professional lives would be forever tied to the bandit, especially Detective Russ Fall, Sergeant Charles Gross, and Inspector Cy Yendes. He had been in charge of the Detective Bureau since 1920 and had already made a name for himself in law enforcement circles nationwide. He is the one name from Dayton that most frequently appears in books about John Dillinger. The other central person in the local Dillinger saga, and the other person whose name most frequently appears in Dillinger books, is Mary Jenkins Longnecker. She abandoned her children in Pleasant Hill to come to the big city, Dayton, Ohio, to get away from her husband. Once here, she would end up living in a boarding house at 324 West First Street. She liked to have a good time, so she would attend Recreation Hall on East Fifth Street to enjoy the walkathon, dances, and other events held there. It was there that she met a girlfriend by the name of Mary Ann Buckholz, who would join her in a trip with Dillinger a few months later. Mary Jenkins was originally from Bedford, Indiana. She had a brother named Jim who had killed a man during an armed robbery. He was incarcerated in the Indiana State Prison beginning in 1929. It was there that he would find a cellmate, and that cellmate was John Dillinger. It was through Jim that Dillinger became fascinated with Mary and promised to visit her when he was paroled. That happened on May 20th, 1933. At the age of 29, and after nearly 9 years in prison for a botched grocery store holdup, Dillinger was a free man. By the end of the month, he came to Dayton, and he found Mary at Lucille Stricker's boarding house. Thus began the summer romance between the two. Many people think Dillinger was in Dayton maybe only a couple of times, but he was here at least 8 times. He was here in May, he was here in June, July, August, and September 1933. One of those visits in June led to the robbery of the new Carlisle National Bank on June 21st. The heist was $10,600 cash. That's $212,000 in today's money. And with it, Dillinger committed the very first of what would be many bank robberies. And I like to show this picture because the bank is still there and it has a nice placard on the side. It's a wonderful placard, but I always have to point out that the date on the placard is wrong. It was June 21st, not June 10th. Now, this is a picture of the new Carlisle Bank teller window that is in our exhibit at Carlisle Historical Park. Dillinger would come and he would go to Dayton for trysts with Mary. He'd spend a night or two in Dayton, and then he would leave to commit bank robberies throughout the Midwest. He was under the radar of law enforcement for the first few months after his parole. He and Mary did not have to hide from the world. They would dine at Pete's Greek Restaurant at 3rd and Wilkinson Street, the Pony House Saloon on Jefferson Street, and Vargo's Restaurant on West Riverview by the tire factory. While at Vargo's in late July, Dillinger and Mary decided to pick up her girlfriend, Mary Ann Buckholz, who lived on Oak Ridge Avenue at the house that you see up here in the upper right. And by the way, that house still exists today, and it's probably the only structure where Dillinger was. I don't know if he was inside, but he was at least outside that location. But they picked up Mary Ann and they headed to Chicago, where they spent the weekend taking in the Century of Progress World's Fair. And on the way home, Mary Longnecker convinced them to stop at the Indiana prison so they could visit her brother Jim. The connection between Mary and Dillinger was fueled by exchanging letters when they were apart. Now, I can account for at least 7 written between the two. Mary did not keep the letters or her romance of Dillinger a secret. She confided in her landlady, Mrs. Lucille Stricker. By mid-August, Dillinger started to gather the widespread attention of financial institutions, the press, and of course, the police. The Indiana State Police was sending out wanted posters, and on October 25th, the private Pinkerton's National Detective Agency notified Dayton police that they believed Dillinger was coming to Dayton to visit someone named Mary Jenkins. The fugitive was in Dayton 3 times in the last couple of weeks of August before Dayton police had determined that Jenkins was in fact Mary Longnecker. But in the next month, Dayton police were ready when Dillinger came to town in his new Hudson Terraplane. In the early morning hours of September 22nd, 1933, Dillinger drove into Dayton, and under the cover of darkness, he strolled up the steps of the boarding house. Mrs. Stricker let him in, and then she immediately dialed the police. Sergeant William Aldridge took the call. Inspector Yendes and Captain Earl Yates were notified. Thanks to the installation of radios just a year earlier, Captain Yates was able to have his officers set up on the perimeter streets near the boarding house, while Sergeant Gross and Detective Fall responded to the scene. The inspector and the captain took positions outside the house, while the 2 detectives entered with Sergeant Aldridge, who stood in a position on the 1st floor. Mrs. Stricker led the detectives to the 2nd floor. At about 1:30 a.m., Mrs. Stricker knocked on the door and called out to Mary. When she answered, the detectives barged into the room. Surprised, Dillinger dropped the pictures that he was holding from the World's Fair. Fall shoved a shorthand shotgun in his chest and told him to put his hands up, while Sergeant Gross held aim with a Tommy gun. Sergeant Aldridge ran upstairs and took control of Mary. Sergeant Gross' handcuffs were placed on Dillinger, who was taken into custody. This was the first arrest of the notorious bank robber. Excuse me. Now, I like this particular photograph, this slide, because everybody knows what Dillinger looks like, but very, very few people know what the officers look like who made that arrest. And so I leave this slide up for just a second so people can soak it in and see who those officers were. Now, the fugitive was conveyed to police headquarters on South Main at Market Street, as was Mary. She was later released, but the fugitive went nowhere. The market headquarters is no longer there. It's that space is now the Greater RTA Central Hub. Dillinger was photographed and he was fingerprinted by the Bureau of Identification, and he was interviewed by Yendes, Gross, and Foll. He was surly. He was uncooperative. He was placed in a holding cell while the word went out of his arrest to other police agencies. Later that day, he was transported in the Black Maria paddy wagon to the Dayton Central Police Station on 4th Street between Sears and Webster Street, and he was held there overnight under guard by officers cradling Tommy guns. The picture up in the top left, I took that picture several years ago. It doesn't look that way. It is now a paved lot there, and I think there's condos on the right side of that paved lot. Here is a 1930 Black Maria that we have on display, very similar to the one that was driven by Dayton Patrolman Thomas Dunleavy. In my book, I tell a couple of stories about Patrolman Dunleavy. One in particular talks about how he lost the entire top half of his ear. I kind of bring this spring series, Far Hills series, full circle because this particular paddy wagon is on loan to us from the collection, classic car collection of Esther Price candies. And I believe there was a representative in the first month from Esther Price that spoke to the audience. Besides the paddy wagon at the exhibit, we have a Dayton City jail cell on display, and that has proven to be real popular with visitors for photo opportunities. Now, the guns and cash confiscated from Dillinger were shown to the press on the morning of September 22nd. We have Dillinger's gun and the handcuffs placed on him on exhibit at Carlisle Historical Park. We also have Chief Wurstner's 1920 Colt service revolver on display to show the contrast of the firepower of the good guys with the high capacity firearms of the bad guys. While Dillinger festered in Dayton jails, his buddies were in the Indiana State Prison. Dillinger was in the Montgomery County Jail for about a week or so. His buddies had prison plans for their escape, and those plans were devised by Dillinger before he had been arrested in Dayton. And they also had weapons that he had arranged to be smuggled into the prison. On September 26, Mary Longnecker's brother Jim, as well as 9 other inmates, broke out in what is considered the most daring and largest prison escape in Indiana history. In Dayton, bank officials from 4 states sought Dillinger for trials. 2 were from Ohio, including New Carlisle, 1 in Kentucky, 1 in Pennsylvania, and 5 from Indiana. In a surprising move, Judge Patterson and Dillinger's attorney, Jack Egan, agreed 2 days before the extradition hearing to have Dillinger turned over to the Allen County authorities to answer for the Bluffton, Ohio bank robbery. The Allen County Sheriff was escorted by the bank flyer as far north as Troy, where they were met by an armed Lima police escort. Dillinger was treated well in the Lima jail, but as 2 weeks passed, the constant armed guard began to relax. Johnny and Mary had their last exchange of letters, with her telling him she would accept his marriage proposal and he telling her to forget him because he was looking at some serious jail time. In the meantime, Dillinger's gang of escaped convicts decided to conduct a quick heist of a known target. Charlie Makeley, who at one time had a gang of his own, was from St. Mary's, and he knew the town's First National Bank. On October 3rd, he, Harry Pierpont, Russell Clark, and others robbed it of $12,050. That's the equivalent of $241,500 today, in what was considered an unexpectedly huge heist. Now, we have one of the St. Mary's bank teller windows on display, along with a map depicting the 4 Ohio banks robbed by Dillinger's gangs and related accounts. On October 12th, these same gang members traveled to Lima, entered the Allen County Sheriff's Office, confronted Sheriff Sarber, and shot him dead. Mrs. Sarber heard the shots and brought the keys to free Dillinger, hoping to save her husband. Sadly, she and a deputy were locked in a cell, and their son, Don, himself a deputy, discovered his mortally wounded father a short time later. Dayton police did not participate up north in what was termed at the time as Ohio's largest manhunt, because local officials thought Dillinger may come to Dayton looking for Mary Longnecker, or that the gang might commit a robbery here just as reprisal for his arrest. And besides that, Lima officials came to Dayton instead. It became the central meeting place for lawmen heading south to search for the gang believed to be in Hamilton. As it turned out, the gang was nowhere in Ohio. In 1934, the Dillinger legend grew in the national press with each exploit and escaped from the law, and was closely followed by readers of the 3 Dayton newspapers. It was not until 1934 that Hoover's government men were authorized by Congress to even carry firearms. In May of 1934, a federal crime bill was passed making bank robbery and other crimes federal offenses. On Dillinger's birthday, June 22nd, 1934, he was named Hoover's very first public enemy #1. The bandit's notoriety extended to his gang members and to the gals that followed Mary Longnecker, first by Billy Frechette and then by Polly Hamilton. Hamilton lived with the operator of a lucrative brothel in East Chicago. The madam was Anna Kupanis, but she went by the name of Anna Sage, and she is infamously known as the Woman in Red. Betrayed by his movie companion, John Dillinger was gunned down outside the Biograph Theater as he ran from federal agents, 1 month to the day after his 31st birthday, and exactly 10 months after he was arrested by Dayton police detectives. His former girlfriend found herself in the national news one more time. When asked about her thoughts of Dillinger, she remarked that he was one swell guy. Now, this is a who's who of the gangsters, mobsters, and bootleggers that I have either mentioned or shown already during this presentation that operated within the corridor or in Dayton itself. As you can see, there were several that were Dayton residents, including Al Fouts, Bob Zwick, and some of Zwick's gang members. And of course, Charlie Makeley was close by, relatively in St. Mary's, Ohio. But I did not even talk about the 5 who appear in this slide and in my book. There is a common link for Dayton with underworld characters, and that is Dillinger's attorney, Jack Egan. He represented gangsters with Dayton ties, like Dillinger, but Al Fouts, Charles Dayton Slim Stimmel, Delaney, and Karpis. There's a book that was written by David Greer, since you had him last month. He probably mentioned it, but it's called God is Merciful, The Colorful Career of John Egan, and I highly recommend that book as well. After Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd was named public enemy #1. He's the guy that roamed up northern Ohio. There was a feared threat to come south to the Dayton area. He was killed by G-men. He was followed as public enemy #1 by Babyface Nelson, who was a member of the Dillinger gang. He met the same fate. The 4th public enemy #1 was Al Karpis, who absolutely threatened to kill J. Edgar Hoover in a letter mailed from, of all places, Dayton, Ohio. The 5th public enemy #1 was a fellow by the name of Al Brady. He wasn't represented by John Egan, but he robbed a Dayton jewelry store and 2 Lima jewelry stores, and he was killed by agents in 1936. Standing between all of these thugs and innocent civilians is the thin blue line. The investment to protect citizens by the city of Dayton during the Great Depression included uniforms, radio cars, and much more, such as top-tier training. In 1935, Chief Rudy Wurstner had been with the department for 33 years, 10 of those years at the helm. In 1935, he was the nation's longest-serving major city police chief, and he would still be the dean 14 years longer until 1949. Besides this notoriety and credit for the local arrest of John Dillinger, he was a founder and president of the Ohio Police Chiefs Association in 1933 and 1934, and that's an organization that still exists today. He used his professional stature to get two men appointed to the earliest training classes in two prestigious national academies, and both men would succeed him as police chief. In addition to training, the city of Dayton invested in regional crime lab for criminal forensic technology, such as bloodstain examination and postmulage processing, which is preserving shoe and hand impressions by wax or plaster casting. Dayton police established the second ballistics lab in the state of Ohio. They had experts in fingerprint analysis. The Dayton Detective Bureau and the Dayton Bureau of Identification were called upon to conduct regional homicide investigations. There is an exhibit related to the Detective Bureau and the Bureau of Identification in recognizing Inspector Cy Yendis. Now, despite the city's investment in equipment and technology, it did not invest in police personnel. The crime rate doubled during the decade. An FBI study insisted that Dayton should have 300 police officers, yet the number dropped from an authorized level of 223 in 1930 to 152 by the end of the decade. No city in Ohio paid a lower salary to its police officers than Dayton, Ohio. In 1937, 3 Dayton police officers, the 3 that you see on this slide, they traveled to Middletown, Ohio to meet with other lawmen in Southwest Ohio. The grassroots campaign of the Fraternal Order of Police took hold, and the Dayton FOP Lodge was formed in 1938. Officers still worked an average of 48 hours per week when other city employees were working 40 hours per week. But the Dayton FOP was able to advocate for a reduction in the number of hours to 44 by 1952 and to improve their pay. Now, what I'm going to do is kind of close out this presentation and the Great Decade with one story each from 1939, 1940, and 1941. On September 20th, 1939, Dora Rice, who had been appointed Dayton's first Black policewoman 10 years earlier, was telephoned at home by a police dispatcher. Her husband, Sergeant Lucius Rice, was needed for a manhunt, and you may recall I showed Sergeant Rice very early in this presentation. She sent the sergeant, who had a storied career, in search for a killer. Upon finding the suspect, a gun battle ensued. Sergeant Rice was shot in the abdomen. He'd been shot in the stomach in 1926, but he survived that particular wound. This time, he did not. He died. Sergeant Rice was the longest serving area police officer to die in the line of duty until 80 years later, when Detective George Del Rio was shot and killed in 2019. Dora reunited with her husband less than 6 months after his death, when she died in March of 1940. Tried and convicted, Eugene Harris was sentenced to death in the electric chair, which was carried out almost exactly a year after his capture. Harris is the only person in the history of law enforcement to be legally executed for the murder of a Dayton police officer. On October 13th, 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt was in Dayton on a campaign visit. Dayton had installed the first radio transmitter in a patrol car as a precautionary measure for the presidential caravan. Dayton police, with Motorola equipment and a presidential visit, became the nation's first municipal police department to equip an entire police fleet, 37 radio cars, with two-way radio communications. The advantage of this innovation for Dayton lawmen patrolling streets was clearly demonstrated in action less than 8 months later. On May 24th, 1941, a honeymoon couple, Betty Austin and Ray Epperson, were staying in Dayton. The groom was a parolee from the same Indiana State Prison in Michigan City that once held Dillinger. The newlyweds had committed a multi-state robbery spree in early May and were wanted by authorities in Richmond, Virginia, and Baltimore, Maryland, before traveling north from Kentucky to Dayton through the corridor. While staying at the Gibbons Hotel, they learned that another lodger, a caravan manager, had $1,700 in proceeds, which is about $30,000 in today's money. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the couple robbed him at gunpoint, placed him in a closet, and fled. As the getaway car sped away, Patrolman Dan Sammons and Walter Hammond rounded the corner in a two-way radio car. Patrolman Hammond instantly radioed the dispatcher. The chase reached speeds of 75 miles per hour on South Patterson Boulevard, flying past Carlisle Historical Park until abruptly turning into Calvary Cemetery. Their car was trapped at the gateway when the officers pulled perpendicular to it. A blazing gun battle took place in the dark confines of a graveyard. Ray was willing to give up, but his moll, hell-bent to get away, began blasting her Colt. Patrolman Sammons was shot in the shoulder. Patrolman Hammond's skull was brushed by a bullet soaring through his hat. In the return fire, a bullet seared the forehead of the gun moll, who also sustained 4 wounds to her back. Unlike Bonnie and Clyde, both suspects were taken into custody and convicted of their crimes. Less than 8 months after the shooting, the pulp magazine Complete Detective chronicled the gun moll's daring honeymoon in a December 1941 issue. It was one of their feature stories. Something else happened in December of 1941. On December 8, 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt gave his forever remembered Day of Infamy address to the nation. The United States' entry into the war consigned the Great Depression to being the great anxiety of the past. By then, local law enforcement had a legacy, and that legacy was that of professional police officers. So, if I could end my presentation, I'd like to do it this way. We want this exhibit to be the catalyst for our far larger vision. We're looking for support for our museum initiative, in particular businesses and individual benefactors willing to embrace and financially anchor the project. Our goal is to raise $1.5 million to construct the building. So we are seeking major sponsors that recognize the value that a police museum has for our local community to educate, to inspire, and to intrigue, especially kids, with Dayton's storied law enforcement past. So if you're associated with a potential sponsor that would be open to learning more through a personal meeting, please let us know. And the brochure that you've been shown is available at Carlisle Park. They have stacks of them there. Feel free to stop by, visit our exhibit, pick up a brochure. That's our vision. We believe the time is right to tell our story. And with that, I again encourage you to visit the Bootleggers, Bandits, and Badges exhibit. And at this point, I think I am open for questions, and I would like to thank all of you for attending this presentation.
Thank you, Steve.
Steve, this is Donna. We really did appreciate the presentation very much. I don't know what the questions are, Chris, but I'm going to ask one anyway since I get to be one of the facilitators. What really in this region created that corridor? Why was there such a crime corridor going from Hamilton up to Lima all the time? It seems like such small towns, it just doesn't make sense.
Well, a lot of your gangsters would find refuge in small towns. And in this particular case, we had a number of them that happened to live in or have girlfriends and family members that happen to live in these small communities, Lima and Hamilton, and they use those as their hideaway places. They would also go to smaller towns like Richmond, Indiana, and other places. They stayed away from the big cities unless they wanted to go there to enjoy the entertainment that big cities had to offer.
Now, I also remember reading in your book, you talked about the fact that there were only 3 incorporated cities in the area that had actual police departments. One was Dayton, which you talked about.
Right.
The other 2 were?
Oakwood was the second in 1908. It was established, and it had a police department, and it was a consolidated police and fire department. And it's by the way, it is the second oldest consolidated police and fire department in the nation. And then the third one was Miamisburg, and I believe that was in 1922. There wasn't another incorporated city in Montgomery County until 1955 or 1956, and that would be Kettering. And I think there is somewhere in the neighborhood of 16 cities in Montgomery County today.
Chris,
Do we have any other questions? I do know that I did my bachelor at Ohio Northern, which is right outside of Lima, and Dillinger is still very well talked about in that town. Many decades later, he's still very well. I don't know if it's celebrated, but he's very infamous to their history.
Well, there's an Allen County, the Allen County Historical Society has a museum there, and it's a beautiful museum.
Yes.
And I would encourage anybody that wants to take a road trip to go to Lima and visit that museum. But within that, they have an exhibit on John Dillinger and the Allen County Sheriff's Office.
Well, I think since there aren't any more questions, again, Steve, I really appreciate you taking time to do this. I've learned a lot. You're starting to get some thank yous for this. Boy, did I learn a lot about Dayton history by seeing it through the eyes of a police force. It was quite striking, all of the different things that were going on within the city itself in terms of what we now consider kind of the underside of society, but at the time was much more open and acceptable.
Yeah. Well, I thank you very much, Donna, and thank you, Chris. And I'm sure Elizabeth is there somewhere, so I thank her as well. And I will stay here until you shut me down.
I think that without any.
Thank you. And this will be up on YouTube probably next week. And hopefully other people could come and watch it. Spread the word.
Yes.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.